Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm always thrilled to be able to bring this information, hopefully, to a new audience and people who may not have been exposed to some of this work before. So, just a quick, affiliations, declarations of interest. What's probably the key here is that I have never received any funding from the companies that make the products that I study. I'm studying an idea, and that is that our nutritional environment is not adequate for our brain. In order to do that effectively with controlled, blinded trials, you need micronutrients in a pill form and you need a matching placebo. That's all they've ever provided for free, but all the other funding comes from other sources that I've listed there. And just to acknowledge that Bonnie and I do receive some royalties from the Better Brain, but we do funnel a lot of that back into research. So I don't need to tell this audience about the scale of the problem that we have more and more people being identified with mental health challenges. It's going to bankrupt us. Many people, certainly in my country, I'm guessing it's the same in the United States, wait months, if not years, to receive treatment. And I think we have to acknowledge that our current gold standards are turning out to be less effective than we had hoped. That's not to say they're not effective. Psychotherapy medications absolutely play an important and essential role. They can save lives. But I think that anyone who works in this space will know that people can continue to be impaired despite receiving the best treatment. So what else can we do? I want to focus then the talk on nutrition, and I'm ambitious. I want to talk about the dietary environment, and then I want to talk about my research because you might as well hear about what I actually do during the day and where my expertise lie. So, but I think this is an important one, really useful for talking about nutrition with clients, is that our brain punches above its weight. So it's 2% body weight. But when you eat, 20 to 40% of the nutrients that you're consuming go towards brain metabolic activity. So you need to be thinking and asking people, well, what did you eat today? Is it feeding your brain? And I don't think that's something that we often think about. We might think about food for muscles or for our heart, for growing if you're a child, but we often overlook the importance of it for brain health. Meanwhile, we have one of the biggest social experiments of what I think of all time, and that is the ultra processed food industry and environment. We know that in America, I think it's 69% of young people, no, let me start again. 69% of the calories of young people are coming from ultra processed products. So that means that they are consuming foods that are essentially nutrient poor. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I think is fundamentally wrong with these foods. So we've shifted from an environment where our ancestors ate mostly real whole foods. Processing came along. We could think about that as coming along millions of years ago with the introduction or the ideas and the invention of cooking, fire, that had massive implications in terms of our brain development. Canning, freezing, those are forms of processing. Fine. You're taking a real food and you're preserving it in some way. It's this that's the problem. It's the introduction over the last few decades of ultra processed products. And the way they've been defined is that they are chemically altered. And this one's a really easy one, and I like this one when I'm explaining it to people, is it contains ingredients not found in your kitchen. So if you turn the package around and you start looking at those numbers, then that's a really good indicator that that's an ultra processed product. Now, there may be one or two, maybe a preservative. That's not what is the essential problem. It's the cocktail of those additional things that are added to it. And then the fact that people are consuming those in every single meal. And so while one package or one type of food might be identified as safe, what has never been investigated is this cocktail effect of consuming all of these foods much of the time and the impact that's having. There is research, though, now coming out about some of these additives, like the emulsifiers or preservatives, et cetera, and we are identifying that they are playing havoc with our microbiome. So if we are changing massively the food environment, what we know has also happened is that the food environment of our moms during pregnancy have changed dramatically. So if you have a mom who is nutritionally deprived during pregnancy, and that child is deprived of nutrition in early childhood, high consumption of ultra-processed foods, that leads to an increased risk of lower birth weight factor for these problems. The children are increased risk of irritability, mood problems, impulsivity, difficulty concentrating, more difficulty in managing emotions. Now, I'm not saying that if you eat a Twinkie during pregnancy that all of these things are going to happen, but the more that mom is eating ultra-processed products during food, the greater the risk. And I acknowledge there are many, many other risk factors that are associated with the development of these problems. But there's a lot of research that has been following mothers over time. And these are some of the observations and the significant observations that have been noted. So in terms of what's wrong with these ultra-processed foods, the one that often people will think about is sugar a day. I'm suspecting that that would be comparable, if not higher, in the United States. That is 6 times higher than what the WHO recommends as a daily intake. So yes, that's a problem. But as I mentioned, there's all these other things that have been added to products that we also need to care about, which is these emulsifiers and flavors and thickeners. But the last one I want to highlight, and which is going to be the focus of my talk, is this, is that we've gone from eating these real whole products like, say, corn, to eating corn chips or all kinds of things that have been derived from corn. And what happens when we consume our diet is based on taking some of these originally whole foods, changing them radically, and then consuming them that way, is that it's leading to a displacement, a nutritional displacement, meaning that we are eating less foods that are the real whole foods, and we are getting less access to vitamins and minerals that are contained within real whole foods. So these foods, the ultra-processed products, have been identified as being low in vitamins and minerals. And so I'm going to hopefully convince you why you should care about that. I do want to say some good news is that if there's good consumption of real whole foods during pregnancy, that protects, particularly making sure that there's consumption of omega-3 fatty acids during pregnancy. Best way to get that would be fish, but you can get it through other sources as well, although that is absolutely the best way to go. And that leads to longer gestation, reduced likelihood of infant death, fewer neonatal care admissions, reduced risk of low birth weight, improved neuronal connectivity of the infant, cognitive development, higher IQ, better reading, lower rates of developmental disease. Everything is saying the same thing, should pause us to at least think whether or not we should apply precautionary principle here and consider adapting and modifying the food environment. There are, of course, randomized control trials that have been done in non-pregnant populations where if you change the diet, that improves the outcome for that person. There are now randomized control trials that are being done manipulating diet during pregnancy and then observing the impact that has on infants. Those are starting to come out. But I'm also going to share some research with you on supplementations and the impact that might be having on mom and the outcome for her infant. So it should at least be getting us to really reflect on the next generation and how to optimize the health of the next generation. So dietary patterns in the 21st century, we know now a lot. I've just been to the International Society Research Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research, ISNPR, in Taiwan. The next one is in Ottawa in 2027. And that's a wonderful group of researchers all over the world who are looking at the impact of diets and supplements, omega-3 fatty acids, on mental health. And I can really confidently say that we have so much robust research, observational, cross-sectional, longitudinal, randomized control trials that are all real whole foods, high in fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, grass-fed meat, fish. The lower your likelihood of mental illness, the more you eat the Western style diet, the greater the likelihood of mental health illness. And those types of associations have been shown for depression, anxiety, neurodevelopmental disorders. So we feel pretty confident about these associations. If we teach people how to eat a whole food Mediterranean style diet, there's now 4 studies that have done that specifically with depression, adults, teens. One was done with just men. And when you help people change their diet, then that can lead to remission, greater likelihood relative to their control groups. And the studies have varied from 3 to 12 weeks. Sometimes they have a one-on-one with a dietitian. Sometimes they just get a video. But the remission rates in those studies is about a third who receive dietary counseling, and 8% was reported in one study, 0% in another for those who receive peer counseling. So hopefully the obvious takeaway and the low-hanging fruit here is that we should be getting everyone to eat better. And that's always what I say is food first, even based on my research, even the benefits that we observe with the micronutrients. I still think this is such an important message. However, I want to highlight a few reasons why that may not be sufficient, especially in our current modern food environment. We are not adequately remineralizing our soils. So we are simply putting in some fertilizers that may have your potassium, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, but we are not necessarily adding in all of those other trace minerals. And so when there's been research that's been done looking at the mineral density in soil, we're observing depletions happening in really important nutrients, like, for example, copper or selenium or iodine. We're selecting our food because it tastes sweet or that it stores well, transports well. We're not selecting it based on its nutritional density. We select for high yield. So if it grows quickly, the problem with growing quickly is that our primary source for getting minerals is is the plants uptaking it through the soil. And if the plant doesn't have adequate time to do that because we're selecting breeds that grow quickly, then the plant doesn't have as many micronutrients. The plant uses the minerals to make vitamins. We make a few in our microbiome. Our bacteria make some B vitamins, vitamin K, but for the most part, the only way that we get vitamins and minerals, actually, there's one more, vitamin D, of course, from the sun, but the best way is either eating plants or eating an animal that has eaten those plants. We're using things like glyphosate, pesticides on our crops. That was once originally patented as a mineral chelator. So what it can do is attach itself to minerals, the minerals either in a plant or in the soil, and therefore you can end up with that leading to less nutrients available in the actual plant. Increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to greater growth, but that the plants are growing faster. And again, you end up potentially with mineral depletions, and that's been shown with controlled experiments. The health of our gut is influencing our ability to absorb nutrients. Some people have I would call an inborn error of metabolism. I'll explain that actually in a second, but basically it means that you don't make an enzyme. There's a defect in making an enzyme that means that it's not as effective at doing what it should, and that'll become more relevant in a second. Our mitochondria you may have inherited genetics that influence the functioning of your mitochondria. So therefore, your need for nutrients is higher because the manufacture of ATP is entirely dependent on the availability of vitamins and minerals. And then we live in an environment that's stressful, and the fight-flight response is very hungry for nutrients. It requires vitamins and minerals to make adrenaline, for example. And so if you're under chronic stress, you end up nutritionally depleted. Your body is going to choose to give the nutrients to something that requires immediate attention, the fight-flight response, at the expense of longer-term function, like your sleep, like your mood, like your anxiety. So no wonder we get really irritable when we're under a lot of stress. That would be one explanation, at least, for it. And then also acknowledging lifestyle phases, like teenagers, their brain is undergoing reconstruction, And so therefore their nutritional needs are higher, or during pregnancy, or even when we age. So all of these factors could result in fewer nutrients available for brain health. So these micronutrients that I've alluded to, why do you need them for your brain? Very put simply, as I said, needed for the mitochondria, needed for brain signaling, making neurotransmitters, supporting inflammation, making anti-inflammatory molecules, supporting our DNA to keep them healthy, and then also supporting detoxification pathways. So put very simply, brain metabolism is just A to B. A could be tryptophan, B could be serotonin. You need an enzyme, hence why I said if you have a defect in that enzyme, this particular chemical reaction could be a bit slowed down. The good news is that when you add cofactors, that helps support and speed up that enzymatic reaction. So one way of addressing that would be just to simply give more of those cofactors needed if there's a difference. So if we then look at serotonin in a bigger form, then you see that there's these different vitamins and minerals. So I often get asked, well, what's the magic one? And I would say that's the wrong question, because you need them all. And if you just give one, then that can lead to depletions in others. And then if you then look at it in the even bigger picture, I showed you just those chemical reactions here. And then you start to appreciate the complexity of this system. And this is just serotonin production. And again, all of that, all of those different reactions that are happening are dependent on the availability of vitamins and minerals. So if you're not getting them out of your food, then that is a very good clue that you may end up having a brain that is running on empty. So it leads to this question of, what about supplementation? Could that help? And I do just continue to want to emphasize that I see supplementation as simply proof of principle, and that is that the food environment does not provide adequate nutrition for our brain. So the way we have studied this, I've been doing this research for almost 2 decades. But we obviously we start with case studies. So I had a case in 2007, a case of a teenager with OCD. I had treated with um, I treated him with cognitive behavior therapy about a year. Not great improvements. I had heard about the micronutrients for Bonnie Kaplan, who was my PhD supervisor, and I heard about some cases where OCD completely disappeared. So I told the family about it. I said, I have no idea. I've never used these micronutrients before. And within 2 weeks, his OCD symptoms had gone into into remission. He came off of them, the symptoms returned, he went back on, they reduced again. So when you observe something like that as a scientist, I think it's really our obligation to study that idea. And so I followed that up with case series, case controlled studies. I'm at my 13th randomized controlled trial. We've done effectiveness studies, systematic reviews, and also meta-analyses. So we've got that pyramid of evidence behind us now. And just to put it into one slide, if we look at this globally, the number of randomized controlled trials that have studied the concept of what I'd call a broad spectrum of micronutrients, I've included here ones where they do B complex with some minerals. I don't think that's perfect, but I've included them. I've also included non-clinical trials here in the just sort of adding up the number of studies that have been done, placebo-controlled trials. I don't think that's perfect either, because non-clinical trials mean that you have less opportunity of observing change. But regardless, when we add them all up, what we see is that there's been now 63 RCTs globally studying this idea on mental health and different psychological symptoms, which means that we've got 78% of them have been positive. So when I say positive, that means the micronutrient arm outperformed the placebo. Negative means that they were identical. Both groups probably got better. So you can see that there's a breadth of different areas that have been researched. So I'm going to share with you now for the remainder of most of my talk is just some of those studies. And of course, they come from my lab because that's the ones I know the best. So I acknowledge that. I mean, I don't know if that's a bias or not, but it's just that's the ones that I can really speak to and know the depth of those studies. So what's in a broad spectrum? Nothing special. All your vitamins, typically all your minerals, essential minerals. Sometimes they'll have amino acids in them. But the important factor here is that, and this one is something that people struggle to get their head around sometimes, particularly if you've grown up with the concept of recommended dietary allowances or RDAs or DVs or whatever it is on the back of the packages. We've been brainwashed into thinking that's all we need. But know that the RDAs were never developed with the brain in mind. And knowing that the brain is the most metabolically active, or what, is a pretty metabolically active organ, it is a bit surprising that we haven't updated the RDAs. There's a big push to do it, and not a simple thing to do. And what I have learned is that there's a lot of players involved, and some do not want that changed. And certainly the food industry would not want us to reveal that the foods that they are providing us with are not adequate to meet our needs, our metabolic needs. So in our studies, what we take into consideration is the UL, which is the upper limit. Now, the upper limit does not identify an area where you suddenly have a toxicity, but the more you go over that, the greater the likelihood of it something, having a side effect. Like if you go over the UL for magnesium, you'll get diarrhea potentially. But also understand that the ULs have been developed and identified looking at that single nutrient by itself. And hopefully I've convinced you that single nutrients by itself don't make any sense and that we need them all collectively, hence why we want to always be eating the rainbow of food. We want variety. And so if you study that one nutrient by itself, then that could lead to a deficiency. So for example, if you just give zinc, that could lead to a copper deficiency. And so the UL for zinc is based on that. So, but if a product has got copper in it, then that becomes less of an issue. So you can push the zinc higher above the UL without the likelihood of having a negative effect. So just understand that this is a complex system, but also know that most supplements that are sold in the supermarket are about 25% RDA. I mean, they've never been studied for mental health. There's just a few B complexes that have been, but for the most part, they haven't been studied for mental health. And I guess you hopefully you ask, well, why would they? And most people don't focus on psychiatric symptoms, but the companies that I've ended up working with are interested in that. And that's why I've ended up sort of sticking with generally the same sort of products, some variability, but I keep coming back to them because they make sense. And there's not a lot of other products that I've come across that make this level of sense. So we give our participants, up to 12 pills a day. If there's issues around pill swallowing, Bonnie Kaplan has developed a pill swallowing videos to help people with that. And so we found that really good with kids. And these are the ingredients. So you can't absorb this entirely, but just to understand that a lot of these are going over RDA. And if you look at some of those, like the B12, there's a lot of B12 in there. That's way thousands times over RDA, but then there's no upper limit for B12. There's no toxicity that's been at this point identified from that. So it's that doing that doesn't make it unsafe. It's just a little bit outside of what we're used to. So what have we done? I'll just give a little bit of just one slide on ADHD. And I'm just saying, what was our CGI, clinical global impression improvement, much to very much improved at the end of an 8 to 10 week trial. How many of the kids on micronutrients or the people with ADHD were identified that way? How many on placebo? Our first one, adults with ADHD, about 50%, just under, much to very much improved, and about 20% in our placebo. We then replicated that with children. We got the same response with the micronutrients, slightly higher placebo response. That is something that's happening in my lab. People come in and they just feel better because they've heard so much about our research. Jenny Johnston replicated this research in the States. This was Ohio State University, Oregon Health Sciences, and then Lethbridge in Canada. And they recruited kids with ADHD and emotional dysregulation. They had a higher response, 54%, and a lower placebo response. That was published in JCAP a couple of years ago. And then these data are not published, but this is from a trial we did with teens, and we're seeing the same thing. So about 50% response, and then the placebo response varies a little bit. This is an interesting finding from the Maddie study in the States, was that children in the micronutrient group grew 6 millimeters more than those in the placebo. So knowing that stimulants can impact on growth velocity, this is a really good news finding. We also observed this effect in our research as well. Ours wasn't quite as strong. It was a 3.8 millimeter difference, but the trend was there. You might say, RCTs, they really don't tell us about real life, and I agree with you. And so when we look at open label response rates, these are kids who have stayed on the micronutrients for usually about 4 months. We're finding that about 2/3 of them do really well. And that was identified in the Maddie study. So these data here are the end of the RCT, and then the placebo gets switched to micronutrients, and then they're both ending up at about 2/3. They published this a couple of years ago, and then I thought, oh, why don't I look at our data? And we found exactly the same results here in New Zealand, where about 2/3 of them are responders. So if you're using this clinically, you can say about 2/3 of kids, if they stay on the micronutrients, some will not swallow the pill, so I acknowledge that as a problem. There's not a high dropout from side effects. Diarrhea can happen the first couple of weeks. That tends to resolve itself with making sure you take the nutrients with food and water, or you just adjust the dose for a while. But overall, that's where we're hitting. So that's good news to know that you have a number, at least in the ADHD population. Longer term, when we follow people, we find it's more like 75 to 80%. Understand that these are now observational data, and these are families who chose to stay on the nutrients. There's lots of reasons why they stopped, the cost being one of the big problems. That hopefully one day might get fixed. Insurance companies might decide this is a good thing to fund. If kids end our trial and switch to medications, they don't do as well. About half of them, even under half, are identified as responders. And then if they stop altogether, this is good information to know that if someone does really well and you're asked the question, do I stay on these nutrients forever? To me, I would say it depends on the condition. But about 20% of them will probably stay well, and a lot of them will regress, and we see that happens over time. So I want to share the Taiora trial. I've shared my slides with Lori, but I haven't included these ones because they're not published yet. And it can take me a long time to get this work published. There are lots of reasons I won't go into and bore you with. But you can imagine sometimes there's some skepticism around the use of nutrients for the treatment of mental health challenges. One of the observations we've made over the years is that people who are really dysregulated in their mood, up and down, irritable, temper in children, anger, aggressive, those kids, those people do really well. And they tend to do really well quickly. So we decided to target teens during the pandemic, and we recruited really dysregulated teens. And they couldn't be on medication. They had to be moderately ill, and they had to be really dysregulated. 63 met criteria for ODD, 30 for DMDD, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder. We have about 11% dropout, or that they were excluded for some reason. So again, acknowledging that there are some kids who don't want to take these pills, especially some of the oppositional ones. So given the benefits it has on ODD and DMDD, we need to figure out a way of getting them to want to consume those pills, because it can be a lot. They can't guess what they're on. That's important. That increases our placebo response, though. That's what I'm starting to realize, that inability to guess. The reason why is that we put riboflavin in our placebo. that changes the color of the urine. So we tell them at the beginning that if that happens, that's not an indicator of which condition they're in. We also say gastrointestinal issues can happen, but we've observed them happening with the placebo. So if that happens, it's not a giveaway. And so they really are struggling to guess at which condition they're in. Um, so I'm just going to share just a couple of slides on this, but I hope that it'll get you excited and interested so that you follow the work and hope to see this published one day. What I've done here is just looked at this is our big finding, and that is the benefit is with those really dysregulated, extremely severe, irritable DMDD types kids and ones from low socioeconomic status. So if you have a teen, sorry, who came in, no DMDD, but low SES. In fact, they do equally on micronutrients placebo, about 50% response rate based on the CGI. If they have DMDD, look at the difference. That's where we have the big hit, the heavy hit. 100% of them did well, a low socioeconomic status, not a lot on placebo. When we look at high SES, you get that same thing. Doesn't matter what you give them. Giving teens an opportunity to talk, they were monitored by clinical psychologists throughout the trial once a month. They had access to someone. We were monitoring suicidal ideation, self-harm all the way through this trial. So they had somebody who they could talk to. They had opportunity every time they met with the clinical psychologist to speak individually with them on a one-to-one Zoom type of call. DMDD, when the high SES, if they had DMDD, you have about half of them responding and none if they were on the placebo. So that's exciting. It is a small sample, statistically significant because it's such a huge effect. But I would love to inspire someone to want to replicate this. This is probably the most important finding from this trial, and that's why I share it, because it's giving us some hope. One of the challenges with our current treatments is that suicidal ideation can go up. And so our data monitoring committee required us to monitor suicidal ideation. We were also interested in it, but we really had to monitor it. Every time the clinician met, they asked the teen about it, and then the teen gave us self-reports every week on how suicidal they were feeling. So based on just that one monitoring weekly, here's what we found. First of all, just to know, not every teen was suicidal. It was about 20% had some level of suicidal ideation and or self-harm. So the kids, these are the micronutrient kids. So you see suicidal ideation dropping over time. And this is placebo. So that between group effect size is a medium effect size. So that's a significant effect where the micronutrients were clearly outperforming the placebo. So hopefully this will give opportunity and choice down the road, particularly if it gets replicated. I want to just switch quickly to stress. We've done some research on stress. I live in New Zealand where we have lots of earthquakes. So we had a really big one, February 22nd, 2011. There was a flood. This wasn't actually in New Zealand. This was in Calgary, Alberta. But we replicated what we'd done in the earthquakes. And then there was this shooting in a mosque, something that is very, very unusual to happen in New Zealand. 49 people were killed. And we provided micronutrients to those who had been affected. Either they'd been in the mosque or they were widows and they were very stressed. So we monitored them. Wasn't a study per se, but it was a clinical intervention where we had the opportunity of monitoring their symptoms before and after getting the micronutrients. So I just shared, there's no placebo here because it's unethical to do that within those circumstances. But here's the earthquake data. We reduced their stress into the normal non-clinical range on average. The flood replicated, and then the mosque shooting replicated. We did have some comparators in those first two studies. The earthquake study, we had a treatment as usual. You can see they didn't really change over the period we were monitoring them. And in the flood study, we had a vitamin D comparator and no change. So that gives us some confidence, and also just know that B vitamins, though, have been compared to placebo in these kind of tragic events, and they've been shown to be better than placebo. So we have confidence that this is a replicated finding. I just want to highlight one study we've done on depression, just because It's a good news story for depression. We monitored, we had 150 people who were identified by their general practitioner, their physician, as as functionally impaired in their mood and or anxiety. And overall, this shows that both groups got better, but the group on the micronutrients had faster recovery. So that's a good news story. So they overall did better. When we look at responders, this is ones who drop into remission. We end up, but you have 61% identified as responders in the micronutrient group, 49% in the placebo, high placebo effect, similar to SSRIs. The number needed to treat is 8, which is on par with SSRIs. I say this is a good news story because it comes with a lower side effect profile. When we look at, though, where this is just looking at subgroups, because I'm really interested in subgroups. You noticed that in that past study that I showed in the one that we're doing with teens, we were looking at, the subgroups of DMDD or low SES. We found that those who were on past medications, no one in our studies there is ever medicated, and I'll explain why. But if they had a past history of being medicated, maybe is that a sort of a proxy for treatment resistant? They've had previous attempts at treatment. If they get randomized to the micronutrients, they do much better than placebo. You don't end up with, because this is the placebo group who have been previous meds, and this blue line is the group of people who were on micronutrients previous meds. So you really you can see that there's a group difference happening there. There's an interaction effect. So again, I'm interested in those subgroups because we can't supplement the world. And if you've got a finite resource, then can we target those treatments? And that's something that we're trying to figure out better. So micronutrients provided the fastest improvement relative to placebo for younger participants, those from lower SES, which is what we observed with the teens, and those who had previously tried psychiatric medications. And so I'm just going to end just give you a bit of data about my favorite study, which is the Nutrimom study. This is a study that we started prior to COVID. We randomized 88 moms to either micronutrients or placebo, 12 weeks in the second trimester. At the end of that, they were all given the opportunity to take the micronutrients if they wanted to until the birth of the child. And then we've been following those kids, and we're now up to those kids are now 5 years old. So we're just analyzing those data right now. Understand that the primary focus of the study was the RCT in pregnancy. But because these studies are so hard to do and we decided, and also because we were finding that there was a lot of fear about referring patients to us in the worries about these nutrients and how high the doses were, that we realized we really had to look at risk and as in any form we could, not just within an RCT, which is where you're looking at side effects, but was there any risk associated with taking the micronutrients on those infants? So we gathered a lot of data on their birth outcomes and then those infants in their first month of life. So we're looking for anything that might be saying, whoa, there's something negative here. No reason to have that, but we thought that would be reassuring if we did find that it wasn't increasing any risk. Understand that these moms were depressed before they came in. So we know that depression increases the risk of all kinds of negative outcomes. In order to contextualize this, we had to get another group. These are not randomized moms. They weren't eligible. They weren't depressed. They were taking psych meds. And so we were able to compare them to standard care. Between 3 to 7% of moms in New Zealand are put on medications. I know are on psychiatric medications during pregnancy. I know that's a bit higher in the States. Monitored again, and we're monitoring those kids. So one thing before I move on to understand those data is that open label trial meant that all of our Nutrimom mums ended up getting some level of exposure to the micronutrients. So we couldn't look at the placebo effect long term, but what we could do is look at days of exposure. So when we compared it to the other two groups, we selected those infants who had at least 2 months of exposure to the micronutrients in pregnancy. So just understand that's sort of how that observational piece works. So the first good news story is that Well, actually, I'll just skip through just for time. You probably know the treatment options. Is that the good news story is that many moms did well, regardless of what they were randomized to. And we had actually it's three quarters of them were in remission in their depression. However, in the CGI ratings, the micronutrient group outperformed the placebo, but it was still quite high. Then when we looked at subgroups, I like this. We looked at this history of medication, and also SAPAS identifies personality difficulties. So if it's greater than 3, they're really dysregulated. So basically what you take away from here is that there's a group of people, no personality difficulties, no past history of meds. They do well regardless of what they're randomized to. So you get a high rate of response. But when you look at that group of really dysregulated mums and past history of medications, you end up with 75% of the response if on micronutrients and virtually no likelihood of response if on placebo. So now the birth outcomes, when we look at preterm birth, lower than our national average in the micronutrient group and lower than the antidepressant group. That was about 20%. That's actually what's been reported prior in the literature. I'm not going to go into the details of observational studies. We understand and acknowledge that depression can lead to preterm birth as well. But the micronutrients might be mitigating those negative effects. Low birth weight, we had none in the micronutrient group. Infant resuscitation, much lower in the micronutrient group relative to both of the other two groups. And then postpartum hemorrhaging, we did not expect this, but much lower likelihood of that in the vaginal births. And then whether or not you ended up in neonatal intensive care unit, higher in the standard care, but not significantly higher. Then when we look at their capabilities in of those early infant, we use the Brazelton, which assesses that. Things like orientation or reflexes, motor control. In everything that we looked at, those micronutrient babies outperform standard care and were either on par with our reference group. Remember, those are basically non-depressed moms not taking these micronutrients. Everything we see, you don't need a statistic to see that they're doing better on habituation to their environment. Autonomic stability, better than the other two groups. Motor control, not significantly better than the reference group, but certainly better than standard care. Orientation, better. Regulation of state, of their emotional state. And then reflexes, abnormal reflexes, higher in the standard care group. So this is a small study. I acknowledge that. This is the first RCT that has been done on micronutrients. There are no RCTs and of antidepressants for us to compare these data to. There have been studies that have looked at Brazelton performance when the infant has been exposed to antidepressants, and our research is comparable. Our results are comparable to those studies. And then what about postnatal depression? If you take micronutrients during pregnancy, does that protect you? And the answer is it does seem to. So we're just looking at the moms who took micronutrients during pregnancy, and then also whether or not they stayed on them post-birth. So we were able to create two groups naturally, those who only took the micronutrients during pregnancy and those who took it at both time periods. It doesn't seem to matter. The time when it's protective is taking the micronutrients during pregnancy. So here's the data for those taking it during pregnancy and postnatally. Their EPDS scores before they come in and before they start the trial are elevated. They're in the normal range at birth, and they stay that way at 6 months. EPDS in that other group, ones who only took it during pregnancy, they are obviously depressed when they start in the study. They do well. They're not depressed at birth, and they stay that way. So pretty clear that the window of opportunity, we think, is during pregnancy. Of course, we haven't done the study of not giving it during pregnancy and then seeing if we give it postnatally, can we have the same impact? We don't know. But we're bringing that risk down to what's pretty standard risk, which is that between it's about 10% of moms will have postnatal depression, and that's what we found in this group of moms who are at high risk, and that number should be 5 times higher if they hadn't had an intervention. So by giving these additional micronutrients have we mitigated the negative effects of poor nutrition, depression, and possibly had a different outcome than antidepressants? So side effects, I've already talked about the nausea, and then we have an absence of a whole bunch of side effects: suicidal ideation, sedation, fatigue, we also observe improved sleep, regulation, emotions, resilience, mood, reduced homocysteine. But one thing, a caveat here, is combining with psychiatric medications needs to be done carefully, and it needs to be cross-tapered. That is, as the micronutrients are introduced, the meds need to go down. This is because this has been observed over time by psychiatrists that they seem to amplify the effects of medication. You're essentially become over-medicated. We don't know why. We have done a study looking at whether or not the micronutrients influence pharmacokinetics, that is how that drug is being eliminated, and it doesn't seem to be affecting that. So we think that it's more likely is more efficient synthesis of neurotransmitters, among other things. So maybe it's affecting pharmacodynamics. So takeaways, number one, food first. Let's clean up our diet. There's so much work to be done here, given the high consumption of ultra processed foods. So those ones are all associated there. And there's a lot of research on specialty diets, ketogenic diet, for example. There's a lot of hype, there's lots of case studies, case series. There haven't been randomized control trials that have published yet. I understand there's quite a few in the works, so hopefully we'll have better indicator there. One of the things about ketogenic diet, we are currently doing one. Well, we actually abandoned it because we couldn't get people to do the ketogenic diet. I think when it works, if a patient, a client is willing to do it, it could be life-changing, but it can be a challenge to get them to do it. So we need to have a lot more research on how do you get the people to actually stick to that diet, because it can be difficult. If you're recommending supplements, just stick to the data is what I can say. And so just a shout out to all of the funders, those independent funders, and also that I've got lots of practical resources if you want to know more. I've co-written a book with Bonnie Kaplan, The Better Brain. I developed an online course that Lori talked about, a MOOC, a mass open online course. You can do it for free on edX. And I've now developed online, University of Canterbury online professional development on nutrition well-being, psychology of well-being, and lifestyle and well-being. If you want to know about the products, that's often the question I have, email my lab. I always feel uncomfortable about talking about names of products because I'm studying an idea, but I have to study something. And I don't manufacture products, so I have to rely on others to do that. And so if you email my lab, mentalhealthnutrition@canterbury.ac.nz, we'll provide you with all of that information and more information than you ever probably wanted, or you can get access to it. It's all written about in the book. I think it's chapter 11. And that is it.